Hello, how are you doing? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing what the appropriate punishment should be for Wasps and Worcester for entering administration. Something that has been a little bit in the news this week. Rob Baxter was very interesting, speaking earlier this week to the media, whether it be relegation, which Worcester has already been confirmed for, what's going to happen with Wasps, and in particular a big discussion around their P shares, basically around their shares in Premiership Rugby, which has all sorts of consequences if they were to lose those. It's a really interesting discussion. It's quite a divisive topic as well at the moment, I think, from fans of Worcester and Wasps about what should happen compared with maybe the Premiership clubs or the RFU or Premiership Rugby. But look, if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment down below. What's your thoughts on this whole situation? Because I know you're all going to have plenty of opinions on it. All right, let's get into it. So, what is the appropriate punishment for Wasps and Worcester having gone into administration? Now, as everyone will probably already be aware of, the RFU rules essentially say that you are relegated into the Championship. We've seen that already confirmed for Worcester. They went into administration before Wasps, and we're now essentially waiting whether Wasps and their administrators are able to find a new buyer for the club before they hit that point. Wasps are basically allowed to miss 2 Premiership matches and potentially still rejoin the league this season. Not rejoin it, but keep playing again this season. That's my understanding of the situation. They've already missed 1 round of fixtures. This weekend they're going to miss another. So then after that, if they're not able to find new ownership before their next fixture, then they would also, I believe, be relegated into the Championship. Certainly it's something that is a very real possibility after what we saw happen with Worcester. Now, John Dobson spoke to the Ruck podcast from the Times and Sunday Times already this season. John Dobson is the head coach of the Stormers in the URC. Have mentioned it on the channel before, if those of you that have watched some of the other videos. But the Stormers were in administration last year. In fact, they're still in administration, and they won the URC last season, because in South African rugby, the whole structure is very different. Going into administration essentially saved the club because the South African Rugby Union were involved, and it allowed the club to go into administration and allowed them to actually move forward. The structure is different in England, that obviously, as we've seen with Wasps and Worcester, is very different. And the RFU rules are very different. It says if clubs go into administration, they are relegated, they are punished. Now, John Dobson on the Ruck brought up the question of why are the measures so punitive in England? Well, that's obviously quite obvious in that it is to stop teams from overspending. There have to be consequences on your actions. And I think most Wasps and Worcester fans would agree with the fact that relegation is a fair enough punishment for going into administration. I haven't seen too many people make the argument that they shouldn't be punished at all. Maybe there are some of you out there, I don't know. Give me your thoughts. I suppose the argument for them not being punished particularly would be the fact that English rugby is in such a precarious situation anyway. We don't want to be losing clubs that have loyal fan bases. We want to try and grow rugby in areas around the country, and the best way of doing that is by giving the clubs the best chance of success. I don't think there's many people that would make the argument for no punishment at all, because as I say, there has to be some sort of consequence. There's also a general feeling in the Premiership that you can't move at the pace of the lowest team financially, or the team that struggles the most, because you won't be progressing essentially. And that's why a lot of the teams are quite in favour of the punishment for Wasps and for Worcester. I know Lawrence Dallaglio had suggested on BT Sport that maybe Wasps shouldn't be punished in quite the same way because of the history of the club and all that sort of thing. I don't agree with that, but as I'll get onto in a short while, I wonder whether, depending where a club is geographically, whether there is a chart, whether there is the suggestion at least that it's worth trying to preserve them because of their importance to the league. Whether Worcester and Wasps fall into that, I'm not sure. If it was Sale and Newcastle, for example, the two teams in the north, I probably would agree with that, because rugby is so focused in the south. It's so focused around kind of southwest London and the southwest of England. We need to grow it in other areas, and therefore I think if it was Newcastle and Sale, hypothetical situation, maybe I'd be more on board with that argument. I'm not sure it's the case for Wasps and for Worcester. Now we get on to the P share. We've already said, I think most of us would agree, relegation, fair enough, that's fine. But the really interesting part of all this argument is what happens with the P share for Wasps and for Worcester. For those of you that aren't too sure, though I think you've probably all learnt by this point in proceedings what the P share is, it's those clubs' percentage stake in Premiership Rugby. All the clubs are shareholders in the league, essentially. And what that guarantees is that they are one of the elite clubs in England. It leads to funding, way more funding, central funding, and that sort of thing. So it's essentially, if you lose your P share, you become like a Doncaster or an Ealing or someone like that who receive far less money in terms of support than the clubs in the Premiership. You're not a stakeholder in the top division in England. So the consequences of that are massive. Now, Rob Baxter was really interesting this week, speaking to the media, the Exeter Chiefs Director of Rugby, and he's essentially defended the RFU and their stance over this, because the suggestions are that the RFU Premiership Rugby are very much looking at the option of taking the P share, buying the P share from Wasps and for Worcester as well, which would obviously have huge consequences. Now, my stance on this is a really difficult one. I'm, in all honesty, still probably trying to clarify what is best. I think, as Rob Baxter has said in that speaking to the media or in that press conference, basically, you can't allow teams to enter administration and not be punished, which I think we can all agree with. Because his fear is, if you allow teams to enter administration, they can go through that, wipe off all their debts and still be a stakeholder in the league, still come back to the league. I think that the P share does need to be on the table as potentially being taken away from the clubs, but I'd caveat that with saying you need to give them as long as is feasible to try and find new owners and new ownership. Again, as I understand it, it's quite a complicated situation once the administrators get involved, but it would be a case of, if they can find new owners, then hopefully they'd be able to keep hold of that P share. But there have been, particularly with the Wasps, there was reported interest in buying the club, but because of the uncertainty over whether they would still have the P share was why they pulled out of the deal, because all of a sudden you'd be buying a vastly different asset to what you would otherwise. So as I say, I think, let's say maybe if it got to the start of next season and there still weren't new buyers for the club, possibly then it would get to a point where they would have had an awful long time to try and find buyers. Then you buy that P share. But doing it immediately now, which doesn't look like it's going to happen, but doing it without giving them the time to try and find new owners and try and find a feasible way forward, then maybe that's where I would say that I wouldn't think that would be right. But look, let me know your views on this. I think it is a complicated issue. I think it is an issue that we're all trying to get our head around. But punishment, what sort of punishment do you think is fair for Worcester and for Wasps? I think most people can agree on relegation. What do you think should happen with the P share? I think for the time being, they need to be given the time to try and prove that new owners can be found, but that can't be an unlimited amount of time. Maybe by the start of next season, maybe by the end of this season, I don't know, but there needs to be some sort of time frame where that decision is made. Really difficult situation, awful for fans of those clubs, but let's see what happens. Even losing the P share, there will still be a Wasps and a Worcester moving forward. There might not be a Wasps and a Worcester being elite level rugby clubs in this country. Is that something that we can accept? Is that something which is feasible moving forward? What is the best for the league? Who knows? As I've already said, beg your pardon, on the channel before, it's going to have to lead to a restructuring in English rugby. There's a lot of talk of a 10-team premiership. Personally, I like the idea of 2 divisions of 8, but I think 8 is probably too much of a drastic change that the clubs would agree to that, because it would basically result in a lot of them agreeing to have to drop down a division. But the game has to change. The structure of the game has to change. There needs to be less fixtures. And what does that do to the salary cap as well? Because already, I know Bristol have said that they're going to miss out on a lot of money from not having home games against Worcester and against Wasps. Close to £1 million they're going to lose out on. That's going to be similar for many of the other clubs as well. So what the future holds, who knows? What is the correct punishment? Frankly, who knows? None of us fully do, but we probably all have an opinion on it. I've kind of tried to give some thoughts of my own, as you can probably tell, particularly once it got to around talking about the P share. I think it is difficult. I think it is a really, really difficult one with huge consequences. But let's wait and see. Remember, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, let me know in the comments down below whether you agree with me, whether you think I'm off my rocker, what you think would be the best situation for these clubs in terms of punishment, in terms of the P share. And look, I'll see you in the next one.